All right, we're going to begin this lecture by speaking about the First Great Awakening. Why don't we do a little bit of review before we begin, though? We'll review with taking a look at some characteristics of revival and spiritual awakening. Now, I brought out a couple different lists of these things before you at different times of this class, and I might not be done bringing out different lists because there's really not an accepted, firm, scholarly definition of revival and spiritual awakening. There's general things that people agree on, but there's not a concrete definition. So here's one that I just want to remind you of here at the beginning of our class today. First of all, there's a remarkable sense of the presence of God. This is sensed by the converted and the unconverted. Number two, now, admittedly, let's take a look at just that first characteristic. That's something that's very difficult to measure, isn't it? I mean, if you experience it, you know what you're talking about, but it's very difficult to measure. Number two, there's an unusual interest in the things of God to the neglect of otherwise normal activities and duties. Number three, there's an evident urgency for getting right with God. Sinners seeking the evangelist more than the evangelist seeking sinners. People just feel this compulsion, this absolute need, this drive that they must get right with God. And then next, there's a great work of conviction of sin and cleansing among God's people. It's kind of interesting. I didn't put these in like a chronological order, so to speak. I think if I were, I would have put this one closer up to the top of the list. And then there's a high level of experience and participation from lay people. I guess this may be greater or lesser according to certain revivals. The particular revival we're going to talk about today, I would call it as lesser in this one. The First Great Awakening was a movement marked a lot of times by big names that kind of had a very prominent role. There are other great revivals that we'll see that weren't really marked by great names. But this one, the First Great Awakening, was. When we're talking about this, again, the First Great Awakening, I almost apologize for the title. Because as we tried to discuss last week, was this actually the first revival in Christian times? No. What would be probably the first revival of Christian times? Acts, yeah. You could make a little debate whether, I tried to make the case that the work under John the Baptist was a revival, but we would still call that pre-Christian. Okay? The first revival, Acts chapter 2. I mean, the beginning of the church was a revival, a spiritual awakening. Then again, you see evidence in the book of Acts chapter 19 in Ephesus, other places as well. But the point of it is that it's not that we have some amazing works of revival and spiritual awakening in the book of Acts, and then we have to wait until 1727 for another one. It doesn't work that way. There were revivals, there were periods of spiritual awakening, but they were not documented carefully, and oftentimes they were opposed or outside of the institutional church, and so there was a great effort to keep, to either lie about them or keep them quiet or whatever. I did mention how revival was manifest sometimes in the institutional church. How would revival be manifest in the Roman Catholic Church, especially in the medieval period? Right, through the establishment of monastic orders. Most monastic orders in the Roman Catholic Church started as basically revival movements within the Roman Catholic Church. All right, so these are some general awakenings. This is just sort of as review. So now let's talk about 6 great revivals or awakenings in the modern period. So when we say the First Great Awakening, we mean the first among these 6. Now here's another difficulty that we have, and I'm sorry to put this upon you. But the terminology I use, but this list is pretty accepted. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This list is pretty much accepted by historians. What's not accepted is the names that they give to them. But most everybody agrees on the terminology of the First Great Awakening. The terminology of the other ones is not universally accepted. So you might say, hey, David, you call this the Third Great Awakening, 1862. Other people call it the Second Great Awakening. Which is it? Okay, I'm just going to say there is no universal agreement as to the terminology. The events are pretty much universally recognized, but not the terminology. So why do I use this terminology? Because I like it. All right? This is the terminology I like. So you have the First Great Awakening, 1727 onwards. And when I say onwards, I mean basically like into the 1740s. Then you have the Second Great Awakening, 1792 onwards. Then you have the Resurgence of 1830. Then you have the Third Great Awakening. Now, what's the difference between the Second Great Awakening and a Resurgence, or the Third Great Awakening and a Resurgence? I would say that the church and the culture didn't bottom out the way that it did with these other movements. England was very dark in the time of the First Great Awakening. There was quite a drop in morality, for example, in America between the First and Second Great Awakenings and in church life. But between the Second Great Awakening and the Third Great Awakening, there was, might call it only a dip, not a precipitous drop. So that's what I'm trying to indicate when I use the terminology of a resurgence. Things didn't go so low. Look, sometimes we say that revival only happens when things are at rock bottom. It's not true. It's not true. Things didn't go so low in between the Second and Third Awakenings and in between the Third and the Third Great Awakening and the Welsh and Worldwide Revival movement. But this is a familiar slide. And basically, our next 6 lectures are going to be taken up with these 6 topics. Okay? Any questions so far? Are we ready to talk about the First Great Awakening? All right. You know what I like about the First Great Awakening? First Great Awakening began in Germany. It's true. How about that, Jana? Now, a quick overview of the First Great Awakening. Some of the notable names associated with this work. First of all, Herrnhut. Herrnhut is not a name of a person, it's the name of a place. But maybe we can tell them what the literal translation of the name Herrnhut means. The Deutsche? Man's hat? Yeah, or Lord's hat, you know. Okay, Herrnhut. Whitfield, who was a great preacher. Wesley. Brainerd, David Brainerd, was a American missionary to the Indians, and then Jonathan Edwards. Well, what happened during, what are the notable marks of progress that happened during this period? Well, there were 150 new congregational churches began in a 20-year period. That's a big deal, especially because you're dealing with a period where there was not a huge increase in population. If you have a huge increase in population, then you might just say that churches are just keeping pace with the population. Though there was definitely an increase in population during this 20-year period, the 150 new congregational churches were a remarkable amount. 30,000 were added to church congregations in a 2-year period or 3-year period between 1740 and 1742. That's a lot. This is speaking about in colonial America, by the way. The moral results were equally, wow, that's spelled wrong, isn't it? Noticeable. They were definitely noticeable. There were real moral results that took place both in America and especially in England, and we'll talk about that. Well, let me just mention it right now. England was in a very, very dark place before the First Great Awakening. Drunkenness, vice, poverty, gambling. I mean, it's just awful moral place. It was in a very morally degraded situation. And it's a very interesting study to find out why, for example, why did England not have a revolution the same way that France did? You know, the French Revolution, whatever you might think of it, I think everybody would agree, it was a bloody terror. It was awful. It was awful. And even if you kind of like the final result, which you could argue with here and there, but let's just say, no matter what, it was a bloody trauma visited upon France. Why didn't England have a similar revolution like that? Most people believe it was because of the influence of the First Great Awakening. That was the difference. 9 universities and colleges were established in the American colonies to train ministers. Does anybody know the name of any of those colleges or universities? Just off the top of your head? Oxford, no, that's in England. These are American colonies. Harvard, Princeton, Yale. Those colleges were established essentially as Bible colleges, more than the Bible, but centered on religious education. They were established to train ministers. Christianity was planted on the wild American frontier. These were decades in which America was expanding to the west. And where would the American frontier be in these years?
A little bit left of Virginia.
Yeah. I mean, not far. I mean, the boldest pioneers were going out to the Ohio Valley. You know, that was real pioneer territory. And then early missionary desire began to emerge. This was the very small beginnings of the modern missionary movement. So this is kind of the general background, the markers, the mileposts that would indicate for us that something remarkable happened in these years. But how did it happen? Well, it happened beginning, of all places, in Europe as an aftermath, you could say, of the 30 Years' War. It's hard to underestimate the trauma that the 30 Years' War was upon Europe. You may or may not be aware of how the First World War was a catastrophe for Europe. Catastrophe. Well, the 30 Years' War, in some ways, was even more traumatic for Europe. Especially because it lasted long. How long? 30 years. 30 years. And it would go over the same territory. The same cities were conquered and burned and destroyed again and again and again. It was bloody. It was kind of a stalemate. It was just a terrible, terrible war. It's estimated that perhaps 20 to 25% of the German population was left dead from the war. Now, not directly from battles and fighting, but a lot of times by the other things that accompanied war: famine, plague, disaster. But think about that. As an aftermath of the 30 Years' War, 20 to 25% of the German population is dead. And it doesn't speak for the other countries as well, although Germany took the worst of it. Now, this ended, the 30 Years' War ended, by the way, for those of you who are into history, that is Gustav Adolphus, the Swedish king, who really was the brilliant general who assured victory for the Protestant side in the 30 Years' War. He died in the war. He was killed in battle near Leipzig. But it was his military genius. There are people who call Gustav Adolphus the first modern military thinker in general. And I don't know, I mean, this has got to be the last great Swedish general that there was in the 17th century. But it's weird to think of Sweden being a European power. But they definitely were in the 30 Years' War. And they basically rescued the Protestant side. If it was not for the Swedes, the Protestants probably would have been defeated, and Catholicism would have been imposed upon all of Germany, all of France, all of the Netherlands. It was a different situation altogether. They conducted the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. The Peace of Westphalia was signed in the town hall of the city of Münster. By the way, if you come with us on our European tour next year, we're going to visit the city of Münster, and not only will we see the cages hanging from St. Lambert's Church, which I spoke to you about last time, but we'll also go inside the room, the very room where they signed the Peace of Westphalia, which to me is pretty cool, because this essentially ended religious wars in Europe. Now, you could argue about Catholic and Protestants in Ireland, but leaving that aside, this ended religious wars in Europe, and everybody was sick of religious wars in Europe after this. So the Peace of Westphalia was a very, very big deal. Now, it left it, though, afterwards. Excuse me. You know what? Maybe I need to answer this text very quickly. The people on the camera won't mind at all as I just tell someone, yes, but I am teaching a class right now. And I will get back to them later. All right. Exclamation point. Okay. But the bottom line is this. After the 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia, listen, wartime often leaves cultures in a very low spiritual state and a degraded state. People really trust in God during warfare. There's oftentimes a real turning to God in the midst of it. Not always, but often. But when the war's over, man, usually there's a significant decline in spiritual things and oftentimes in morality. Now, God He raised up a man, I would say, in Europe after this period, a man named Philip Jacob Spener, to make a difference. Spener was born in the Alsace region. The city then, or the village then, was called Rappersweiler. Today it's Ribauville in France. It's about 200 kilometers west of Stuttgart. Spener was wonderfully converted during his university studies, and eventually he became a pastor in Frankfurt in the year 1666. Now stop right now. Does anybody remember the date I gave you for the beginning of the First Great Awakening? 1727. I'm talking about a guy who was key in the work of the First Great Awakening, becoming a pastor in 1666. In other words, what we're talking about with Spener is the groundwork that would lead into the First Great Awakening. At Frankfurt, Spener reformed religious instruction by doing something radical. You know what he would do at his church there in Frankfurt? He would preach on whole books of the Bible. He would teach verse by verse through whole books of the Bible. Radical. He would restore the confirmation service, and he would set aside days of fasting and prayer. He set up small groups within the church where pastors and laymen would meet together to study the Bible and pray together for mutual edification. In our own modern day church terminology, he taught verse by verse through books of the Bible, called people to fasting and prayer, and got them together in life groups to pray and seek the Lord together. He called these small groups as, and he's using Latin terminology here, ecclesiolae in ecclesia, which means little churches in the big church. The idea was basically this. He's going, look, I got this whole church, and a lot of these people aren't saved, and a lot of them don't have any spiritual interest. Why don't I really pour into the people who probably are saved and really do have a great spiritual interest, and I'll really focus on developing those people spiritually. Now, one thing you have to understand about Jakob Spener and his church back then was, anybody want to guess what kind of pastor he was? Was he a Lutheran pastor? Was he a Baptist pastor? Was he a Pentecostal pastor? What kind of pastor was he? Lutheran, right? With the German state church. The German state church and Lutheranism in that day was organized according to what, well, in the English tradition, you call it a parish, which means you ministered to a neighborhood, to a territory. You know, if this were right now the parish church of this, we might be responsible for everybody to State Street, to Milpas, and up to Haley, you know, and back to the sea. And that would be our parish. And everybody who lived in that area was supposed to come to this church, because this was the church. There weren't a bunch of other churches. I mean, there was the German state church, and that was it. Other places might be the Catholic version of the Roman state, of the German state church, but here it would be the evangelical, the Protestant version of the German state church. Now, there was a strong, how would you say it? A strong pressure on people who weren't even born again to go to church. Why would they go to church if they weren't born again? Tradition. Not just tradition.
Big part of the community.
Yeah, there was huge social pressure upon a person to do that. A lot of it comes out of a medieval mindset, but there's huge, for a person in 1670 who lives in the area where Spener is a pastor in Frankfurt, there's huge social pressure on you to go to church, whether or not you're a believer. I mean, you were baptized into the church, your parents were Christians, well, or at least they were also baptized in the church, and you just go because that's what you do. And I don't mean to be weird about this. One of the reasons why you go is because there's nothing else to do. You don't have a lot of entertainment options. And actually going and listening to somebody or being around other people is kind of interesting, whether or not you're born again. What I'm trying to get at is this. When I preach to a congregation on Sunday morning, I'm fairly confident that not every last person in that congregation is born again. I think most of them are. I think pretty safely you can say most of them are. But I don't even know what percentage you want to say. 80%, 90%, 95%, but whatever. But I recognize not everybody not everybody who attends this congregation on a Sunday morning is born again. But in a church like Spener's, a much higher proportion of the congregation is not born again. A much higher proportion. Matter of fact, you might only have 20 or 30% of the congregation that is born again. Everybody else comes because they have to. Tradition tells them they have to. Social pressure tells them they have to. Tradition tells them they have to. Whatever it is, they come because they have to. Spener says, I want to heavily invest in those who are born again and meet with them and strengthen them and bless them. So you get kind of this idea of the church within the church. And that's some of the characteristics here of his pietistic or pietistic, people pronounce it different ways, ideas. Jacob Spener is the founder of pietism. Again, some people say pietism, some people say pietism, but he is the founder of this movement known as pietism. Now, pietism, I think, gets a lot of very unjustified criticism. There are theological and practical, when I mean practical, I mean out in the life, problems with pietism when some of the things in it are exaggerated. But the basic pietistic impulse, I think, is a godly desire to simply live out the Christian faith. The basic pietistic impulse. And the basic pietistic impulse, look at these things that were their features. Number one, the little church in the big church. Okay, you got the big church, but most of them aren't born again. Let's focus on the ones who are. Secondly, well, and isn't this a different way of just saying we're going to emphasize discipleship? And if I'm going to emphasize discipleship, why am I trying to disciple people who aren't born again to begin with? Then you have the central importance of Bible study. The pietists were really into studying their Bibles. Secondly, there was a restoration of the idea of the priesthood of all believers. Now, this was an idea that was put forth in the Reformation, but it was only an idea by the time Spener was doing his ministry, at least in Germany. People were very much filled with the idea, you are the pastor, you do the work, we'll just kick back, we'll pay you to be a Christian for us. Spener said, no way, we're all priests, we all have a ministry before the Lord. Then the Pietists spoke of true faith being expressed not in knowing the truth, but in doing deeds of love towards one neighbor. How do I really know you're a believer? Not by what you believe, but by seeing that worked out in love towards your neighbor. Avoidance of theological disputes. Now, the Pietists were just kind of this. Again, you can see a little bit as being an outgrowth of being sick of the theological wars in Europe, where they're like, dude, let's just chill a little bit on the theological arguments. Let's just agree on what we agree on and love Jesus together. There was an emphasis upon spiritual life and devotional literature in training ministers. When you would train people for ministry, you would not just focus on theology, you would focus on the life. And then the preaching that was emphasized was preaching that should awaken faith and its fruits in the hearers. This is what we're aiming for. We're aiming for preaching that really brings people to faith, and that faith that has fruit in the life of the believer. This is the kind of ministry, this is the kind of church life that Spener emphasized there in his church in Frankfurt. He had an emphasis on the new birth and on discipleship, and it sort of undercut the role that a very kind of scholastic orthodoxy had taken in the German Lutheran Church of that day. This guy brought a new life to German Lutheranism. It had really gotten bogged down just in theological arguments and positions, and he said, man, let's go for some spiritual life. Now, after Spener, another guy named August Hermann Francke, he took up the role after Spener. He was the informal leader of the pietistic movement. Francke was born at Lübeck. He studied at Erfurt and at Kiel. All this is northern Germany, on the coast mostly. Erfurt's not on the coast, but he became professor of Hebrew at Leipzig in 1684. He was converted in 1687, and he began to conduct, now I want you to notice this, he began to conduct Bible classes at Leipzig, and that led to a revival among students and townspeople. The faculty of the university at Leipzig objected to his religious work, so he left, and eventually he became a professor at the University of Halle. That was in 1692. So he helped to make Halle a center of piety and missionary enthusiasm, and he established a Bible society there at the University of Halle. Now, what's so important about Spener and Francke? They had a great influence on this guy. Nicholas Zinzendorf. I give you kind of his full royal name, although there's probably more to it than that. Nicholas Ludwig Count von Zinzendorf. He was a Moravian missionary leader. We'll talk about him. But most of all, he was a nobleman. Now, one thing you got to recognize about German nobility at this time, politically, Germany was very fragmented. There was no German state. Bismarck had not come along and done his thing yet. But what there were a bunch of small kingdoms, or they would often call them principalities. And so there was a very complicated royal system in Germany at this time. But this guy was a legitimate ruler, a legitimate count, not a prince, not a king, but lower than that. Graf, right? That's what a count is. Yeah. Fürst would be a prince, a leader, but yeah. So what's the gradations you have? First you have a Fürst, then a Graf, then what's below that? Of like the Adel. Anyway, whatever. So, I mean, what I'm just trying to get at, he's a legitimate player. Now, his father was a very high government official in Saxony, but he died when Zinzendorf was only 6 weeks old. So he was brought up by his grandmother, who was a friend of Jakob Spener. His grandmother was a friend of Jakob Spener, and he was influenced by Franke. When he was 10 years old, he was sent to Franke's grammar school at Halle. He and 5 other Christian boys, again, this is when they were little boys under Franke's influence, they founded a club that they called the Order of the Grain of the Mustard Seed. And they pledged themselves to love the whole human family and to spread the gospel. So he went on to study law at the University of Wittenberg and Utrecht. Now, he's living the life, he's a believer, he loves Jesus, but he's just living his aristocratic life. I mean, look, life is good if you're Nicholas Zinzendorf. You know, you got money, you got prestige, you're going to have to work for a living, but you'll probably work at a high status job where it's not so much work, but pretty good pay. You know, life is good. And when he finished his studies, he did what all fashionable people did at that time when they finished their studies. They went on a tour throughout Europe, right? You finish your studies, you go on a tour. So he's on a tour through Germany at the time, and he goes to an art gallery in Dusseldorf. And in Dusseldorf, he sees a painting that captures his imagination. The painting is called Ecce Homo. Now, Ecce Homo, I think, is Latin. It's taken from the line in the Gospel of John where Pilate tells the crowd when Jesus is being beaten before his crucifixion. After he beats Jesus, he holds him up before the crowd, and Pilate says, "Behold the man. Look at the man. Behold the man." That's what Ecce Homo means in Latin. Behold the man. And it's a biblical phrase. So when you see that phrase, it's going to be tied to the suffering of Jesus. So here's Jesus with a Roman soldier. Sorry, it's a little too light in the room to see it good. Here he is with his scepter to mock him. He's got a crown of thorns on his head. He's being mocked. Now, I suppose that this was written on the frame, or maybe it was written on the wall next to this painting. But it was written, probably in German, although it could have been in Latin, this phrase, "All this I did for you. What are you doing for me?" Zinzendorf looked at that picture, he read that inscription, and he was just absolutely cut to the heart. He said, Jesus did this for me. What am I doing for him? And instantly, I think he understood that a lot of the way that he had kind of planned to live his life was pretty empty. And it was like right there and then, he said, I'm going to live my life and bring glory to Jesus Christ. So what did he do? He decided to leave his job as a government official for Saxony, and he decided to give himself for full-time Christian service. Now, again, when Zinzendorf gives himself to full-time Christian service, he does it the way an aristocrat does. He doesn't say, I'm going to pastor a church. Are you kidding? He's a count. But he says, I'm going to take my estate lands and I'm going to use them for the glory of God. So what does he do? Well, he invites Christian refugees to come and work his land. Okay, that's what he does. By the way, Zinzendorf was, for all of his life, an aristocrat. He used his influence in a wonderful and a godly way, but nobody should think that the guy lived as a common man. If you did a missions trip with Zinzendorf, you'd be sleeping on the floor of a church somewhere. Zinzendorf would be at the 5-star hotel down the way. But look, that's not to say he didn't love Jesus. It's just that was the kind of life he lived, and there were no qualms about it. The guy was still an aristocrat, but he wanted to use his influence in a godly way, and he did. Now, I told you that one of the things he did was he said, let's take the family land, the family estates. Look, a big part of being a count or a graf or whatever you want to call it, a big part of this is you own a lot of land. And a lot of your revenue comes, think of Downton Abbey, right? A lot of your revenue comes from people working the land and paying rents and all that kind of business. So what Zinzendorf says is, let's use my land for God's glory. I'm going to bring in refugees, persecuted Christians from other parts of Europe to come in and work my land. Now let me ask you, why would there be persecuted Christians in other parts of Europe?
Because of the wars.
Because of the 30-year wars, right? If you're a Protestant in an area that's settled Catholic, you might not be very welcome there, and you might look to move away. And so that's what Zinzendorf did. And he brought to his estates some people known as the Moravians. Does anybody know anything about the Moravians? Does anybody know where Moravia is? I'm looking over at our European table. Does anybody know where pardon me? Very good. It's in the Czech Republic. Moravia is an area in Eastern Europe that's in what is today the Czech Republic, the eastern part of the Czech Republic. This generally is Bohemia. You can see it down here. This is Bohemia. This is Moravia. The two different areas, or actually there's more than two, but they are two different areas of the Czech Republic. Now, 100 years before Martin Luther, so how long would this be? This would now be something like 200 years before this time. Actually 300 years. 300 years before this time, there was a great work of God, you could even call it revival, in Bohemia, in the city of Prague. Who was the leader? A man named Jan Hus. One of the ways that Jan Hus brought great revival to a city? By teaching through books of the Bible, verse by verse. Friends, this is one of the most remarkable things you find throughout church history. When people start teaching through the Bible, God moves in amazing ways. I'm not saying that's the only way God moves, but man, that's what you see in so many cases. So in Prague, which by the way, I can't tell you on this map where Prague is, but it's somewhere in Bohemia. There's a great work of God, and there are people who are followers of John Hus. After Hus's death, by the way, does anybody know how Hus died? Hus died when he was he was commanded to come to a church council where his views would be discussed. Essentially, his views would be put on trial. But the Pope himself promised John Hus that he would have safe passage from Prague, from Bohemia, to the council, which was going to be held at Constance, Lake Constance, there in southern Germany, northern Switzerland. He would have safe passage from there to Constance and back again. In other words, we're not going to arrest you, we're not going to do anything. Reluctantly, Huss agrees to go to this to defend his views. As soon as he gets there, they arrest him. A few days later, they burn him to death. That's what they did to John Huss. Well, look, it became very dangerous to be a follower of John Huss. They organized themselves and they called themselves the United Brethren. And this group influenced Luther. He clarified his own evangelical position through a study of the Moravian confessions. During the 16th century, they spread beyond Bohemia and Moravia into Poland, Prussia, and Hungary. But then the terror of the 30 Years' War fell very heavily upon the Moravians. And their organization was crushed in Bohemia and Moravia, which became largely Catholic. So what did they do? They fled. They were refugees. And fugitives from Moravia found refuge on the estates of Zinzendorf in Saxony. Now, they were joined by others. The people who worked the estate of Zinzendorf were not only Moravians, they were also believers from other backgrounds, and they all gathered together. There were some German pietists, and they worshipped at the Bertholdsdorf Lutheran Church under a pastor there named Pastor J.A. Rothe. So there they are gathered together. They live at his estate. Oh, there's John Huss being burned to death. That hat signifies that he's a heretic. That's a heretic's hat. And they're burning him at the stake. This is where Zinzendorf's estate was in modern Germany. You can see, it is just a few kilometers from the Polish border. So it's all very far in the east, almost to the Polish border. This place, the village is called Herrnhut. And you can see this marker is where it is. You can see it's almost halfway between Leipzig, there's Leipzig, and Warsaw. It's like almost halfway between them. There's Dresden. Where are some other cities notable? Dresden. Prague is down here. One other thing I wanted to show, one other city, where is it? Görlitz. I was looking for Görlitz. Because there's a Calvary Chapel in Görlitz, but I don't see it right now. Is it down? Is it south of that?
No, it's just, what is it?
Oh, there it is, right there. It was too close. I was looking too far. Where? There's Görlitz. Okay, so anyway. So this is where Herrnhut and Zinzendorf and the Moravians are. Now, about 1724, they decided to continue to do the church and really have these influence from the Moravian brethren there. But the Moravians wanted to do their own kind of church. They really weren't into the German Lutheran thing. They just came from a different tradition. So they said, look, we're not going to oppose. We don't think you're evil, Pastor Rothe, but we're going to do our own thing. And we're still going to come like to the Sunday night service there. We want some unity, but we want to be able to have our own church services. Now, Zinzendorf was gradually drawn into the unusual congregation that was made up of people who lived and worked his estate. He became their leader. And in the following months, there was a great spiritual awakening. I'm going to read you a couple quotes from a book. It was a condition and not a theory that confronted the young nobleman in 1727 at Herrnhut. How to unite in faith and love and service the pious but argumentative followers of Huss, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, Schwenkfeld. It seemed to be a hopeless problem apart from divine intervention. You know what the problem is? You bring to your estate a bunch of refugees from different backgrounds, and they've got to work and live side by side with each other. They argued all the time. Heated public controversies were not uncommon. It seemed they argued about everything. Predestination, holiness, baptism. It seemed unlikely that the community was going to last much longer. Zinzendorf led them to agree to seek out and to emphasize the points where they agreed. This was some of Zinzendorf's pietistic training, rather than to stress their differences. And Zinzendorf had a personal interview with each individual adult resident of Herrnhut. Now, I don't know how many people there were. I'm just going to throw out maybe between 100 and 200 adults. I'm just guessing. I mean, this was a large estate. It needed a lot of people to run it. And think how remarkable that is of Zinzendorf. Again, he wasn't a pastor in the classic sense, but he said, I'm going to meet with and pray with every adult individual in this group because we got to have unity. We got to have a collection here. Now, on May 12th, 1727, they entered into, okay, here's some slides. There's the estate there at Berthelsdorf at Herrnhut. And here's kind of a timeline. May 27, 1727, they entered into a solemn covenant with Zinzendorf to dedicate their lives to the Lord the same way that he dedicated his life to the Lord Jesus Christ. I mean, it's a very kind of challenging thing to do. This nobleman, again, I want you to understand, he's a nobleman. They are peasants. He's educated. They're uneducated. But you know what? They both love Jesus. And Zinzendorf, in this very unusual way, this nobleman sits down with a peasant and he asks him about his soul. He asks him about his spiritual condition. He prays with him and then he makes a challenge to him. He says simply this: will you dedicate your life to serving Jesus the same way that I have dedicated my life to serving Jesus? And can you imagine the impact that would make upon the people who served there? They'd say, you're a count. You're an aristocrat. You've dedicated your life to serving Jesus? Well, then I have to do the same as well. And everybody in a unified way said, we're all going to be totally committed to the Lord in whatever calling God has given me. Zinzendorf, he's given you one calling, another person's given your calling. But listen, Zinzendorf, I am going to be just as committed and faithful to God in my calling as you are to yours. They weren't trying to say that everybody had the same calling. Then they organized elders to lead some times of Bible study and prayer. And this eventually brought together on August 13th, 1727, something that was remarkable. And we'll go by the timeline. The July before this great outpouring, so not in May, but in July, Zinzendorf spent time ministering to a group of 9 schoolgirls who were between 9 years old and 13 years old. He started teaching them in a class, and he noticed that on the outside, they behaved very properly. These were good girls. But he noticed that on the inside, you couldn't perceive that there was any true spiritual life in them. No matter how much he spoke to them about Jesus, he could see that it wasn't really connecting. So here's what you had. You had some nice girls, 9 to 13 years of age. They were good girls. I mean, they weren't out doing bad things, but he could tell that they didn't have spiritual life. What did he do? He prayed with them. He just counseled them. On July 16th, at a meeting, Zinzendorf poured forth his heart in prayer and in tears. This had such a striking effect on the rest of the meeting that many people began to pray in a way they had never prayed before. On July 22nd, several of the brethren agreed to get together. They did this on their own. Zinzendorf didn't tell them to do it. They said, let's get together. Let's meet together at the Hutberg to pour out. This is a hill as that was part of the estate. To pour out their hearts in prayer and in hymns. On August 5th, Zinzendorf spent the whole night in watching and in prayer. Now, what does it mean to spend a night in watching? Well, you wouldn't spend the whole night in prayer, but you just spend the night reading the Bible, speaking about it with other people, seeking the Lord, asking if God's speaking things to your heart, and then you'd pray. And then you do the same thing, and then you'd pray. That's what it kind of means to watch and pray. It doesn't mean to stay up all night and do this, and then to pray. It's just kind of they spent the whole night seeking the Lord, you would say. And then he did this with a group of about 12 or 14 of the brothers. And then at midnight, they held on the Hutberg a very large prayer meeting, and it was marked by great passion in prayer. And then on Sunday, August 10th, Pastor Rothe, during the services at the Herrenhut, he felt himself overwhelmed by the wonderful and irresistible power of the Lord. And that feeling just spread to the whole congregation. Again, you're talking about something that is hard to describe. And I don't know if it was during the worship, I don't know if it was during the message, but just in the middle of service, Pastor Rothe, he stops and he's like, for at least a moment, he can't go on. He's just so overwhelmed by the presence of God. And then that spreads to the whole congregation. In this frame of mind, they continued. This was an evening service. In this frame of mind, they continued until midnight, praising, praying, weeping in the scriptures. It was remarkable. Then on August 13th, 1727, they experienced what was the most outstanding outpouring of the Holy Spirit for them up to that point. Quote, "What took place at that service can be described only as an outpouring of the Holy Spirit. According to one Moravian historian, the Holy Ghost came upon us, and in those days great signs and wonders took place in our midst. So great was their hunger for the Scriptures that in the days following that service, they gathered together every day at 5 a.m., 7:30 a.m., and 9 p.m. for services. One observer noted, self-love and self-will, as well as all disobedience, disappeared, and an overwhelming flood of grace swept us all out into the great ocean of divine love." On August 26th, 24 brothers and the same number of sisters met and agreed to continue from one midnight to the next midnight in prayer. Now you can imagine how they did it. 12 brothers, or 24 brothers, 24 sisters. They said, okay, here's 12 teams of 12 brothers. 12 teams of 2 brothers. Here's 12 teams of 2 sisters. We'll divide up the clock, and 2 brothers will pray for an hour, and then 2 sisters will pray for an hour. They decided to have a prayer meeting like that. They put it into practice on August 27th. The number of intercessors increased after that to 77 people, and then children started coming and being part of the meeting. That prayer meeting that started on August 27th, it continued every day, 24 hours a day, for 100 years. And if you come with us on our church history tour, we'll go and see the place where that prayer meeting was. It's amazing. I've been there. The prayer meeting lasted 100 years, and more than 100 missionaries were sent out from that very small village over the next 25 years. That's a remarkable thing. What's remarkable about it is not just the prayer meeting. Come on, help me out here. Oh, how come I'm not moving? What's happened to our slides here? Well, that's funny. It's getting the signal. Move me on to the next slide, back there at the computer. There we go. They sent out 100 missionaries over the first 25 years. They went to places like the Virgin Islands, Greenland, North America, Lapland, South America, and Labrador. And look, let me tell you something. These were days, this is before the modern missionary movement. This was missions before people were doing missionary stuff. But it all grew out of this great heart of love and devotion that they had to the Lord. The Moravians were something new, or at least new for their day. I'm not saying it never existed before, but new for their time. People with the passion and commitment of monks who lived in a cloister, but they were married and they lived normal lives. Here was a fellowship of Christians, I'm reading a quote here. Here was a fellowship of Christians, of laity and clergy, men and women, marrying and raising families, with much of the quietism of the monastery and of pietism, but with the spread of the Christian message as a major objective, not of a minority of the membership, but of the group as a whole. Everybody said, let's do what we can to get the gospel out and to serve the Lord. Now, what happened to the Moravian movement? Well, it had a huge influence. Before the end of the 18th century, the Moravians had begun missions work in Russia, India, the Nicobar Islands, wherever those are, in Ceylon, in the Indians of the English colonies in North America, in the Danish and British West Indies, in Suriname, Central America, Gold Coast, South Africa, among the Lapps, Greenland, and Labrador. But not only that, they also went all over Europe. A Moravian evangelist named Peter Böhler preached the gospel in the colony of Georgia, and then he went on to plant the Moravian church in London. Now listen, in that time, England was desperately in need of revival. The city of London, for example, I've heard two different estimates. 1 house in 6 or 1 house in 4 was basically what they called a grog shop. People made homemade gin, and they sold it from their houses. And you could get blinding drunk for a penny. These were the days of the Industrial Revolution. The cities were crowded, conditions were terrible, working conditions were awful. People were living awful lives, and they longed to escape their awful lives. The idea of falling down drunk for a penny appealed to a lot of people. Now, I don't mean to sound crazy about this, but a penny was worth more. Let's just say today it's equivalent to $1. I don't know if it is, but let's just pretend. So for $1, you could fall down drunk for as much cheap gin as you could buy. It was a terrible, terrible situation. There was terrible crime in the street. Quote, "Neither men nor women were safe from these drunken fiends. It was a favorite amusement with them to squeeze their victim's nose flat on their face and bore out his eyes with their fingers." This is what they would do to collapse drunks. Their prisoners were pricked with swords or made to caper with swords by thrusting into their legs. Those responsible to keep law and order in the city failed miserably. Criminals were more likely to get away with their crime than ever to be caught, tried, and punished. The city was kept in constant terror by those who set their own rules. These were days when people were often being kidnapped and sold as sailors to ships or as slaves to colonies in the New Worlds or to big estates outside of London. It would not be unusual for a person to get drunk, collapse, and wake up on a ship. And you're a slave on a ship. Now, they didn't call them slaves. You were an impressed sailor, but basically you were a slave on the ship. Indentured servanthood was another way. One of the big amusements of that day was what they called bull baiting or bear baiting. Does anybody know what this was? Bull baiting, or you could call it bear baiting, was where they would put a bull or a bear and chain them to a post, and then they would send dogs after the bull or the bear. And the bull or the bear would fight the dogs, but eventually they would send so many, and kill the dogs, but eventually they would send so many against the bull or the bear that when this was done to the death, they would kill the bear or the bull. Now, it wasn't always done to the death. Sometimes they would just do it for an hour or so and watch the amusement. Other times, they would do it to the death. And this is the kind of amusement that was popular in those days. It was a very degraded time. It was the kind of time where stage productions, theaters, were very lascivious, were very impure morally. And so what you would have is you would have the theater, and then literally, in many places in London, for example, right next to the theater was a brothel. Because the two of them went together. The clergy and the ministers of their day were hopeless, most of them. Just utter failures to preach God's word or to do real Christian work. It was a dark, dark time in London. And it was in that kind of community that Peter Bowler tried to plant a church. Now, one of the things that the Moravians did together as believers was they celebrated a love feast before receiving communion. So they would have a common meal together and then have communion. On December 31st, 1738, the Fetter Lane Moravian Church, it's just the name of a street, Fetter Lane, they came to church for their annual watch night service. It was New Year's Eve, so they're going to stay up all through the night. They had a warm, normal service, and as the evening passed and the morning of the first day of the new year began, the group started to pray. And as they continued praying together, the power of God came mightily upon the group at about 3 a.m. Responses to the outpouring of the Holy Spirit were different. Some people fell to the ground. They were so overwhelmed by a sense of the presence of God. Others were just filled with joy. They were happy and singing as they experienced the presence of God. Everybody was caught by surprise, but they kind of recovered themselves a little bit and joined together in a hymn. That New Year's Eve prayer meeting was the beginning of the First Great Awakening. Now, that awakening eventually touched a man named George Whitefield. Whitefield put himself through what was called Pembroke College. By the way, look at the picture there. First of all, notice the hands. Whitefield was a very dramatic preacher, always using gestures, lots of stage actions. He was a very active, dramatic preacher. But secondly, notice the eyes. His eyes must have been crossed because not every painting of George Whitefield, but many contemporary paintings of George Whitefield have his eyes crooked. And I don't think that's because it was a bad painter. I think because he must have had some crooked eyes. Anyway, Whitefield put himself through Pembroke College in Oxford by waiting tables upon the wealthier students. Basically, he worked in the kitchen and in the dining hall for the rich students. While he was there, he became associated with a group of very pious Methodists. They called themselves the Holy Club. Now, when I say Methodist, this was before there were Methodists. They called themselves Methodists because they had a method for everything. They were very methodical. They had a method for everything. And this group was led by a group of brothers named John and Charles Wesley, the Wesley brothers. Under their influence, Whitefield experienced a new birth, and he decided to become a missionary to the new Georgia colony on the other side of the Atlantic. So the voyage was delayed. Whitefield was ordained a deacon in the Anglican Church, and he began preaching around London. He was very surprised to find out that even in his earliest preaching, whenever he spoke, crowds just showed up and they hung on every word. But Whitefield had a knack for preaching that was very unusual. He portrayed the lives of biblical characters with a realism that no one had ever seen before. He cried from the pulpit. He danced in the pulpit. He screamed. One of the persons who was just absolutely taken with George Whitefield was a famous British actor named David Garrick. He was the most famous actor in Britain. And he said, I'll try to translate the money, I'd give $10,000 if I could say, "Oh," like George Whitefield says it. I mean, this is how impressed he was with Whitefield and just kind of the presentation that he had. Whitefield had such a commanding voice that it said that on one occasion, when they were crossing the Atlantic in a fleet of ships, say maybe there's 5 ships, Whitefield preached to all 5 ships. He stood at the front of one ship, the other ships kind of laid out in a V pattern, and Whitefield preached to everybody on all 5 ships. That's the kind of commanding voice that he had. But listen, he had to have that kind of voice because he spoke to thousands of people at a time in a day, of course, when there was no amplifier or microphones. Whitefield preached to thousands upon 2 continents. He was one of the first guys to have a real ministry both in Great Britain and over in America. It's estimated that in his lifetime, he preached 18,000 times to perhaps 10 million people. In the year 1739, Whitefield set out for a preaching tour of the American colonies. He went to Philadelphia, which at that time was the most cosmopolitan city in the New World. And he went there first. But not even the largest churches in Philadelphia could hold him. He drew crowds of 8,000 people or more in Philadelphia at that time. And so they started preaching outdoors. Every stop along the way, record audiences came to hear Whitefield. Oftentimes, the crowd that he preached to was greater than the population of the town that he spoke at, which means lots of people were coming from other places. He was often surprised at how quickly crowds would come and how big they were gathered. And the crowds were aggressive. They wanted to hear him. They said that they would elbow, shove, and trample each other to hear godly things from Whitefield. But when he started speaking, the crowd became absolutely silent and listened to him for the entire thing. Now, Whitefield kind of gained the knack for preaching outdoors in America, where their churches weren't big enough to hold the crowds. When he came back to England, pastors didn't want to open their pulpits to him. So what did he do? He said, I'll preach in the open air. In Bristol, England, Whitefield began a young people's meeting. It started with 50 people in his sister's house. But within 6 weeks, the meeting filled a nearby field with 5,000 people. From 50 to 5,000 in a few weeks. This is revival. Or it could be, at least. All told, there were about 30,000 people who came to hear him in open spaces around Bristol every week. Whitefield preached all over England that summer, and during that time, they estimate that he spoke to 2 million people that summer alone. Now, the accounts of revival and illustrations of it in Whitefield's time are filled with persuasive and very fervent praying. When Whitefield preached, people would be overwhelmed by the presence of God, and then they would pray and cry out to God throughout the night. People were critical, though, of Whitefield's ministry. His critics said things like this: why doesn't he preach to the coal miners of Kingswood? Kingswood was a very rough coal mining town that was near Bristol. Had a lot of coal miners, but it did not have a single church. You know what Whitefield did? He said, let's bring it on. So on a Saturday in February, By the way, February is not so great in England. He began preaching to 200 Kingswood coal miners in fields, outdoors, near Bristol. Within a month, there were 20,000 coming to hear him preach at Kingswood. Thousands were converted. And he decided to make a church of it. So he turned the work over to a man that he had met at Oxford University, a man that Moravian Peter Bowler had first met on a ship leaving from Georgia to England. And that man's name was John Wesley. Now, John Wesley was a young Anglican minister who went from England to the American colonies to minister to the Indian natives and to other colonists. But his experience exposed his own spiritual need. Actually, what happened to Wesley was he went over there and he fell in love with a girl. The lady was named Sophia Hopke. And he went over there saying, like a lot of missionaries, he said, I'm not going to get involved in a romance. I'm not going to get involved in a romance. And then he saw Sophia Hopke and he's like, I'm in love. And he became obsessed with this woman. But she ended up getting engaged and marrying another guy. And it was a terrible blow to Wesley. He thought that they were going to get married. He had pinned all his hopes on this. But very suddenly she rejected him and went for this other guy. So what did he do? He left. He booked it out of Georgia. And then on the ship sailing back, he had a remarkable experience. This is his record of what happened on the ship sailing back. He said, at 7 o'clock, I went to the Germans. Now, when he says the Germans, he means the Moravians, the Moravian believers. I had long before observed the great seriousness of their behavior. Of their humility, they had given a continual proof by performing those servile offices for other passengers, which none of the English would undertake, for which they desired and received no pay, such as saying, it was good for their proud hearts, and their loving Savior had done more for them. And every day had given them an occasion of showing a meekness which no injury could move. If they were pushed, struck, or thrown down, they rose again and went away, but no complaint was found in their mouth. So he's looking at these Moravian believers, and he goes, you know what? These guys will clean out the toilets. These guys will scrub the decks. They don't get paid to do it. Nobody tells them to do it, but they do it. And when you ask them why, they say, well, it's good for my proud heart to do something like this. Or they say, what does this compare to what Jesus had done for me? I mean, remarkable. Then he goes on. Here was now an opportunity in trying whether or not they were delivered from the spirit of fear, as well as that from pride, anger, and revenge. In the midst of the psalm where their service began, so there they are under the ship, they're having a service, somebody's reading a psalm, the sea broke over, a huge wave broke over the ship, split the mainsail in pieces, covered the ship, and poured in between the decks as if the great deep had swallowed us up already. Okay, so you get this picture? There they are below the decks. The Moravians are having a service. They're singing a psalm when obviously it's stormy, but a great huge wave crashes over the ship. It breaks the mainsail. Could you imagine what that would be like to be on a ship and hear the mainsail break? And then water starts pouring in from the wave that crashed over the deck. Wesley says what the reaction was among the English. Ready for this? A terrible screaming began among the English. The Germans calmly kept singing. I asked one of them afterwards, weren't you afraid? He answered, I thank God I wasn't afraid. But then I asked, weren't your women and children afraid? And then he replied very mildly, no, our women and children are not afraid to die. Then Wesley had a conversation with the Moravian bishop named Spangenberg. The bishop asked him this, my brother, I first must ask you one or two questions. Have you the witness within yourself? Does the Spirit of God bear witness with your spirit that you are a child of God? Wesley says, I was surprised. I didn't know what to answer. He could tell, and so he asked, do you know Jesus Christ? Now again, get the picture. This guy had served in Georgia as a missionary and was now on his way back. He asked him, do you know Jesus Christ? Wesley says, I paused and said, I know He is the Savior of the world. That's true, he replied. But do you know that He has saved you? Wesley replied, I hope He has died to save me. He only added, but do you know yourself? Wesley said, I do. But Wesley says, I fear those were vain words. Quoting from Wesley, I went to America to convert the Indians, but who shall convert me? Shall deliver me from this evil heart of unbelief? I have a fair summer religion. I can talk well, and I believe myself while there's no danger nearby me. But when death looks me in the face, my spirit is troubled. Nor can I say to die is gain. You can just sense Wesley so tormented by his empty religion there on that ship and being blown away by the reality of these Moravians there on the ship. So when he came back to London, he went to a Moravian chapel on a place called Aldersgate Street. And then he heard the guy preaching, and actually, if I remember right, the guy read Luther's introduction to his commentary on Galatians. Maybe it was Romans. But it was the Galatians or Romans?
Wasn't it Romans 5, 1 through 1?
Something like that. He included that, but it was the introduction, I think, Luther's commentary on Romans. And he understood and applied the message of the gospel to his own life, and he received personal salvation. He has a great line in that. He says that as he sat there and heard the guy read it, and he believed, he said, I felt my heart strangely warmed. And he knew that God had done something to him. Now, Whitefield and Wesley were old friends from Oxford, and eventually they met together in Bristol. Whitefield wanted Wesley to join him in the work of open-air preaching, but Wesley was hesitant. So overcoming his scruples, he preached for the first time at Whitefield's invitation in the open air in April of 1739. Wesley writes this, I could hardly reconcile myself to this strange way of preaching in the fields, of which Whitefield set me as an example on Sunday, having been all my life until very lately so tenaciously in every point relating to decency and order that I should have thought that saving souls was a sin if it wasn't done in a church. But you know what he came to recognize? That open-air services were successful in reaching men and women who could not enter most churches or would not. From then on, he took the opportunity to preach wherever he could. And more than once, he would preach at his father's tombstone at Epworth. He would use his father's tombstone as a pulpit and preach from that place. He continued for 50 years. He would go to churches when he was invited, but if he wasn't invited to preach in the churches, he would preach in a field, in a hall, in a cottage, in a chapel, wherever he could if the churches wouldn't receive him. When somebody objected, they said, Wesley, you can't preach in my parish. Again, you get the idea of a parish. It's a geographical area where somebody has authority over. Wesley, you can't come and preach in my parish. Wesley famously replied, the world is my parish. And that kind of became a motto for Wesley and his followers. The world is our parish. You can't just say we can preach only in a certain area. Everywhere is this. And he never slowed down. Every year he traveled something like 4,000 miles. Now, what's it like to drive 4,000 miles? How much is it coast to coast? 2,000? Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, that's more than from California to New York. He did that every year on horseback. On horseback. And he would just have a normal circuit where he would go. He was an unstoppable worker. He was helped, many people believe, and he kind of says, by his not very happy marriage. It seems that when he and his wife were together, they tended to argue a lot. Wesley said God gave him a marriage that made it easy for him to be away from home. Serious. He married kind of later in life. Sometimes you find that when people get married later in life, they're kind of set in their ways, and maybe this was the thing for Wesley and his wife. I like this little excerpt from John Wesley's diary. I like to read this. I think this is a great thing describing his preaching. Oh, there is preaching in the quarry near Bristol. From John Wesley's diary. Sunday morning, May 5th, preached at St. Anne's, was asked to not come back. Sunday evening, May 5th, preached in St. John's. Deacons said, get out and stay out. Sunday morning, May 12th, preached at St. Jude's. Can't go back there either. Sunday morning, May 19th, preached in St. Somebody Else's. Deacons called special meeting and said I couldn't return. Sunday evening, May 19th, preached on the street, kicked off the street. Sunday morning, May 26th, preached in a meadow, chased out of the meadow as a bull was turned loose during service. Sunday morning, June 2nd, preached out at the edge of town, kicked off the highway. Sunday evening, June 2nd, 10,000 people came out to hear me. And, you know, you think of this, you think of Wesley, wow, preaching to thousands. Look, there were lots of times when he preached to probably 10 or 20 people. It wasn't about the crowd for him, although God brought incredible crowds. But it was really remarkable what God did through this man. Now, Wesley was determined to not start a denomination. You know this idea of the ecclesia in the ecclesia? The little church within the church? That's what Wesley wanted to found. And so his Methodist groups were small groups that would meet within an Anglican church. They weren't supposed to be separate churches. But after his death, that's what happened. After his death, the Methodist denomination began, first in America, then in England, and began as a separate denomination. Now, there was a difference between Wesley and Whitefield. Whitefield was a Calvinist. He believed in Reformed doctrines. Wesley was an Arminian. He believed in Arminian doctrines. I think there's a great example between Wesley, not Whitefield directly, but between a Calvinist named Charles Simeon and an Arminian named John Wesley. And they were concerning the things that they could agree on together. So let me read to you this conversation between Wesley and Simeon. Remember, Simeon's the Calvinist, Wesley's the Arminian. Simeon, sir, I understand that you are called an Arminian, and I have sometimes been called a Calvinist. Therefore, we're supposed to draw swords and fight. But before I begin the combat, with your permission, I'm going to ask you a few questions. Pray, sir, do you feel yourself to be a depraved creature, so depraved that you would never have a thought of turning to God if God had not first put it in your heart? Wesley, why, yes, I do indeed feel that way. Simeon, and do you utterly despair of recommending yourself to God by anything you can do? And do you look to salvation solely through the blood and righteousness of Jesus Christ? Wesley, yes, solely through Jesus Christ. Simeon, but sir, supposing you were first saved by Christ, are you not somehow or another yourselves to keep yourself saved by your own works? Wesley, no, I must be saved by Jesus Christ from first to last. Simeon, allowing then that you were first turned by the grace of God, Are you in some way to keep yourself by your own power? Wesley, no. Simeon, what then? Are you to be upheld every hour and every moment by God as much as an infant is held in his mother's arms? Wesley, yes, absolutely. Simeon, and is all your hope in the grace and mercy of God to persevere you unto his heavenly kingdom, or to preserve you unto his heavenly kingdom? Wesley, yes, I have no hope but in him. Simeon, well then, sir, with your permission, I'm going to put my sword back away again. For this is all my Calvinism. This is my election, my justification by faith, my final perseverance. It is in substance all that I hold, and as I hold it. And therefore, if you please, instead of searching out terms and phrases to be a ground of contention between us, we cordially unite wherein those things we agree. I think that's beautiful. And you know what? Let me tell you something. So much of the people that argue between Calvinism and Arminianism, between Reformed and other, so much of it is argument based on terms and phrases and not basic biblical truths. However, it's fair to make a comparison and a contrast between Wesley and Whitefield. Ready for this? Let's just compare the two guys. Wesley here, Whitefield here. Wesley was the son of an Anglican rector in Epworth. So he was at a little bit higher standing life. I mean, a Anglican rector is not a high man in the community, but he's not a low man in the community either. Whitefield, son of a tavern keeper in Gloucester. Wesley's strict religious upbringing, supervised by his mother Susanna. Whitefield, raised surrounded by worldly influence by his mother Elizabeth, who was widowed when George was 2. Wesley, conversion, Aldersgate Street at London at age 35. Whitefield, Oxford University at age 21. Ordination, Church of England at age 25, Church of England age 22. Now this is what's fascinating. Look at this. Which one was ordained before he was converted? Isn't that interesting? Whitefield's ordained what? 10 years before he's converted. Whitefield is converted before he's ordained. Preaching style, Wesley was intellectual and doctrinal, very line upon line. Listen, they called those cats Methodist for a reason. Line upon line, very doctrinal, very instructional. Whitefield, dramatic, emotional, very dramatic. I wonder what we would do with a Whitefield today. Let me tell you something. I wonder what Reformed guys would do with a Whitefield today. They wouldn't know what to do with a guy who was so dramatic in the pulpit. They would say like, what? What are you doing? Next, doctrine, Arminian, though closer to pietist, semi-Augustinian than Dutch Arminianism. This is true. Whitefield and his doctrine, Calvinistic. Organizational ability, was exceptional organizer, maintained personal control over total organization of Methodist societies. The genius of Wesley was not as a preacher, although he was a good preacher and a capable preacher, he was an organizational genius. Whitefield, he was an able organizer, but preferred to preach and leave organizing to others. Steve looks at me. Prefers to preach and leave organizing to others. Well, okay. When the shoe fits, right? When the shoe fits. There you go. Ministry outside England. Did unsuccessful early missionary work in Georgia. Later preached in Scotland and Ireland. Appointed bishops to supervise the work in America. So never did anything after his conversion in America. Did a little bit in Scotland and Ireland. Whitefield visited Scotland 14 times, participating in Cambuslig revival. Visited America 7 times, becoming catalyst of First Great Awakening. It's really remarkable what Whitefield did in America. You know who is a big sponsor and supporter of Whitefield in America? Benjamin Franklin. huge supporter of Whitefield. And Whitefield actually founded an orphanage in America that kind of ended up causing him a lot of trouble financially. The financial support of the orphanage was a huge burden to Whitefield. And Benjamin Franklin, as a real friend, warned him he should never found this thing. He said, it's going to sink you financially, and it did. It did. You know, even though people were helping, it was a constant burden upon Whitefield to keep this thing afloat financially. But again, notice, did Wesley travel a lot? Yes, but almost all within England. Almost all within England itself. And then his legacy was the Methodist Church. His legacy was the Calvinistic Methodist and an influence on the Evangelical Party in the Church of England. I just think that's a fascinating comparison of the two men. You know, a great motto of Wesley's life was, this isn't his tombstone, it's just a remembrance stone. Remember John Wesley, founder of Methodism, who served as a, by the way, founder of Methodism, I think that would kind of annoy Wesley a little bit. Because Wesley really considered himself a loyal Anglican. He did not want to start a separate denomination. So anyway, founder of Methodism, who served as curate in the parish of Root during the year 1727 to 1729, when his father, Samuel Wesley, was the rector of Epworth. And then here's this great phrase, motto of Wesley: Lord, let me not live to be useless. I don't want to live a useless life. And Wesley was a man who really worked hard to not live a useless life. Now, just a little bit more here on the First Great Awakening. We'll talk a little bit about Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was an American theologian. Matter of fact, I could say without reservation that Jonathan Edwards is the greatest theological mind that America has ever produced. The greatest theological mind. And what's interesting was such a top-rate theologian would be so used in revival. Would you expect that? If you were going to think God was really going to move in revival, would you pick a top theologian at a seminary in that day? No way. But again, this was remarkable about the First Great Awakening. He played a critical role in shaping the First Great Awakening, and he oversaw some of the first revivals in 1733 and 35 at his church in Northampton, Massachusetts. He preached a sermon in Boston that was later published under this title: God glorified in the work of redemption by the greatness of man's dependence on him in the whole of it. And that was a public attack on Arminianism. But he emphasized God's absolute sovereignty in salvation. And there was a real revival that started in his city of Northampton in 1733. By the winter of 1734 and the following spring, over a 6-month period, 300 people were brought into membership of his church. Again, these aren't large communities, so this is remarkable. By 1735, the revival had spread and popped up independently across the Connecticut River Valley, maybe even as far as New Jersey. There was a lot of religious fervor and some fanaticism. Despite some setbacks and a cooling of the religious fervor, it stayed around at least until George Whitefield made several of his visits, and there was a great revival tour in 1739 and 1740. Whitefield and Edwards didn't see eye to eye in every detail, but they certainly agreed on the preaching of the gospel and seeing people come to faith. And so revival began to spring up again. He preached his most famous sermon in 1741 during this revival period. The most famous sermon of Edwards is titled, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. Now, we read that sermon today and it goes, my gosh, how can anybody preach this sermon? But basically, it's a fascinating concept for the sermon. The concept of the sermon is basically this: why isn't a sinner in hell right now? Why doesn't God send the sinner to hell at this moment? And Edwards thinks about it. Is it because he doesn't deserve it? Is it because he's not guilty enough? Is it because, on, and in this very technical way, he goes through a bunch of reasons. And then he tries to say, sinner, you deserve hell right now. The only reason you don't go to hell right this very moment is because you are in God's hand and he is holding you away from hell so that you can repent. But don't presume on God doing that. He uses a picture of somebody being dangled over hell by a spider web thread. In any moment it could pass. Now, reportedly, Edwards didn't preach this like Whitefield. Whitefield would be all like, and you're in God's hand over the thing, and you're spinning. That's how Whitefield would preach it. Edwards read it in a calm, fairly monotone voice. But man, people were totally brought to Christ and to despair of their sinfulness through this message. And it turned out to be a very impactful message that he preached. So again, let's just remind ourselves, what was some of what happened during this revival? We'll end with this. Well, there were 150 new congregational churches began in a 20-year period. 30,000 people were added to the churches between 1740 and 1742. By the way, sinners in the hands of an angry God, Edwards preached that in 1741. So right in the middle of that period. The moral results were equally noticeable. There was a true reformation of society in both England and America as a result of this. I went away from that slide, and it's the last one. So I'll just read it to you. You saw the slide before. 9 university colleges were established in the American colonies to train ministers. Christianity was planted on the wild American frontier, and early missionary desire began to emerge. So, sometimes it's hard to tell geographically where a work of revival begins. But it is pretty cool to me that the first Great Awakening, it pretty clearly began in Germany, in Herrnhut, there with Zinzendorf and his crew. So, remarkable work. Any questions? Yes, Bob.
Going back to the Moravians, prayed 24 hours a day for 100 years. Why did they stop?
Okay, you know what? I'm going to imagine that at many different times during that 100 years, it became formal and legalistic and ritualistic. I'm not trying to suppose at all that for 100 years it was an absolute on fire, amazing prayer meeting. It probably went through ebbs and flows, and they probably thought, you know what, after 100 years, this is enough. Draw it to a close. That kind of devoted effort to prayer is glorious when it's the work of God's Spirit. When it's the effort of man to twist God's arm or something along those lines, it's not so good. Anyone else?
The next 5 classes going to be like the other 5 things from the 6 points?
Yes. Yeah, we're going to go down that list. So what was the next one? The resurgence. Second Great Awakening. Right, okay. That one's really interesting because it ties in a lot more to American history. The First Great Awakening is very big in American history, no, but the Second Great Awakening even more so. All right? Anything? Thank you, Lord. Send another Great Awakening, God. We need it. In Jesus' name, amen.